The first shot rang out just as the blood-red sun kissed the horizon, sending Kieran Kincaid diving for cover behind an overturned wagon. It wasn't how he'd planned to arrive in Utica, Wyoming territory, but then again, nothing in his life had gone according to plan since leaving Texas 3 months ago. "Welcome to town, stranger," a gruff voice called out before another bullet splintered the wood near Kieran's head. 1876 was proving to be a miserable year. Kieran pressed his back against the wagon, checking his Colt revolver with practiced hands. 6 bullets, he'd have to make them count. His horse had bolted at the first gunshot, taking most of his possessions with it. All that remained was the money belt secured around his waist, his revolver, and a photograph of a family he no longer had. "I don't want any trouble," Kieran shouted, his voice carrying across the dusty main street. "I'm just passing through." "Nobody just passes through Utica," the voice replied, followed by laughter from multiple directions. Kieran's heart sank. He'd stumbled into an ambush. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air. He was 30 years old and had survived the war, drought, and a Texas prison sentence for a crime he didn't commit. He wasn't about to die in a nameless Wyoming town at the hands of cowards who wouldn't show their faces. "That's enough." A woman's voice, clear and commanding, cut through the tension like a knife. "Marshal's office has been notified. Anyone firing another shot will spend the night in jail." The street fell silent. Kieran dared to peek around the edge of the wagon. A woman stood in the doorway of a building across the street, shotgun balanced confidently in her arms. Her dark hair was pulled back, and even from this distance he could see the determined set of her jaw. "You in the blue shirt," she called out to Kieran. "Stay where you are. The rest of you go home to your families before I start taking names." Remarkably, the hidden assailant seemed to heed her warning. Kieran heard muttering and the shuffle of retreating footsteps. The woman crossed the street toward him, shotgun still ready but aimed at the ground now. "Thank you," Kieran said, slowly standing and holstering his weapon. "I'd say it's a pleasure to be in Utica, but that'd be a lie." Up close, he could see her more clearly: high cheekbones, intelligent brown eyes, and a no-nonsense expression that suggested she wasn't easily impressed or fooled. "Nora Adler," she said, not offering her hand. "I own the inn and general store. Those were Blackwell's boys. They've been causing trouble since the railroad survey team arrived last month." "Kieran Kincaid," he replied, brushing dust from his clothes. "Just looking for a meal and a bed for the night before moving on." Nora studied him with an appraising eye. "You have the look of a man running from something, Mr. Kincaid. Don't we all?" He managed a half-smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Follow me," she said after a moment's consideration. "I've got a room available and stew on the stove, but fair warning, I don't tolerate trouble in my establishment." "Yes, madam, I believe you." As they walked toward the 2-story building with Adler's Inn and Mercantile painted across its facade, Kieran noticed his palomino tethered outside. "Your horse found its way to my stable," Nora explained. "Animals have better sense than people sometimes. They know where they'll be treated well." "Smart horse," Kieran murmured, patting the animal's neck as they passed. The inn's interior was surprisingly well appointed for a frontier establishment: polished wooden floors, a large stone fireplace, and furniture that spoke of care rather than mere functionality. A few patrons glanced up as they entered but quickly returned to their meals and conversations. "Have a seat by the fire," Nora instructed. "I'll bring you something to eat." Kieran sank gratefully into a chair, his body suddenly aware of every mile he'd traveled that day. The warmth of the fire and the unfamiliar sensation of safety made his eyelids heavy. He forced himself to stay alert, watching as Nora moved efficiently behind a long wooden counter, ladling stew into a bowl. When she returned with the food and a mug of coffee, he thanked her sincerely. "Where are you headed?" she asked, sitting across from him. "Montana, maybe," he answered between bites of the surprisingly good stew. "Or Idaho, somewhere people don't ask too many questions." Nora's expression remained neutral. "Questions can be dangerous things in these parts." But so can silence. Before he could respond, the door swung open, bringing with it a gust of cool evening air and a tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest. "Evening, Nora," the man said, his gaze immediately finding Kieran. "This our newcomer, Marshal Jenkins," Nora greeted him. "This is Mr. Kincaid. He had an unfortunate welcome courtesy of the Blackwell gang." The marshal approached their table. "Those boys are pushing their luck. You hurt, mister?" "Just my pride," Kieran replied, setting down his spoon. "I appreciate Miss Adler's intervention." Marshal Jenkins chuckled. "Half the men in this town are more scared of Nora than they are of me, and with good reason." His expression grew serious. "You plan to stay long, just the night? Then I'll bid you good evening. Nora, could I have a word?" Kieran watched as they stepped away, speaking in hushed tones by the counter. Their glances in his direction made it clear he was the topic of conversation. When Nora returned, her expression was thoughtful. "The room at the top of the stairs is yours for the night," she said, handing him a key. "Breakfast is at sunrise." "Thank you." Kieran finished his meal and stood. "You've shown unexpected kindness to a stranger." "Don't make me regret it," she replied, but there was less edge to her voice now. As he climbed the stairs to his room, Kieran wondered what had brought Nora Adler to this remote Wyoming town, and what kept her here. She wasn't like any frontier woman he'd encountered before. There was something in her eyes that spoke of resilience forged through hardship. His room was simple but clean, with a bed that promised comfort after weeks of sleeping under the stars. A small window overlooked the main street, quiet now as night settled over Utica. Kieran placed his gun belt within easy reach and stretched out on the bed, not bothering to remove his boots. Sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept returning to the ambush, to the sound of Nora's voice cutting through the chaos. Wyoming territory wasn't supposed to be a stop on his journey, it was merely terrain to cross. Getting entangled in local troubles wasn't part of his plan. By the time dawn's first light filtered through the window, Kieran had made his decision. He would be gone before the town awakened. Montana was calling, and the sooner he left Utica behind, the better for everyone. Moving silently, he gathered his few possessions and made his way down the stairs. The main room was empty, the fire reduced to glowing embers. He placed the room key and payment on the counter, then headed for the door. Leaving without breakfast, Kieran turned to find Nora standing in the doorway to what must have been her private quarters, already dressed for the day. "I thought it best to make an early start," he said. "Blackwell's men often watch the roads at dawn," she replied, crossing to the stove where a coffee pot was already warming. "You should at least have coffee and biscuits before you go." He hesitated, hand still on the door. "Unless you're in some kind of hurry that's worth risking another ambush," she added, pouring 2 cups of coffee. Reluctantly, Kieran moved to the table. "1 cup," he conceded. Nora set the steaming mug before him, then busied herself with removing biscuits from the oven. The domestic scene felt oddly comforting and dangerous for that very reason. Comfort wasn't something Kieran allowed himself these days. "I know that look," Nora said, bringing the biscuits to the table. "You're planning your exit route, counting the minutes until you can be on your way." Kieran sipped his coffee. "That obvious? I've seen my share of people passing through." She sat across from him, cradling her own cup. "Most don't have that haunted look in their eyes, though." "I'm not haunted, Miss Adler, just practical." "Practical would be waiting until Marshal Jenkins makes his morning rounds. He could escort you past where Blackwell's men usually lurk." Kieran reached for a biscuit. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Nora's expression remained unreadable. "I don't like seeing people shot in front of my establishment. It's bad for business." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching at speed. Nora was on her feet immediately, moving to the window. "Trouble," she muttered, reaching for the shotgun she kept behind the counter. Blackwell himself and 4 of his men. Kieran joined her at the window. 5 riders were pulling up outside, their leader a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and an expensive-looking hat. "What do they want?" Kieran asked, instinctively checking his revolver. "To make a point." Nora's grip on the shotgun tightened. "Blackwell thinks he owns this town because he owns the largest ranch in the county. He wants the railroad to run through his property, and he's not happy with the survey team's recommendations. And I walked into the middle of this because you're an outsider and Blackwell doesn't like unknowns disrupting his plans." She turned to face him. "Stay here. Let me handle this." Before he could protest, Nora was moving toward the door, her posture straight and determined. Kieran had no intention of hiding while a woman faced 5 armed men, regardless of how capable she seemed. He followed a few paces behind. Nora stepped onto the porch, shotgun visible but not raised. "It's early for a social call, Blackwell," the bearded man dismounted, adjusting his hat against the rising sun. "Not a social call, Miss Adler. I'm looking for the stranger who rode into town yesterday. My boys tell me he's staying here." "Your boys have a habit of shooting at travelers," Nora replied evenly. "Not very hospitable. We take care of our own in Utica," Blackwell said. "Strangers need to understand how things work here." Kieran stepped through the doorway to stand beside Nora. "I'm the man you're looking for." "But I don't recall doing anything to offend you or your men." Blackwell's eyes narrowed. "You exist. That's offense enough in my territory." "Last I checked, Wyoming territory belongs to the United States, not Victor Blackwell," Nora interjected, her voice carrying across the still quiet street. A few townspeople had begun to appear, watching from a safe distance. "The railroad's coming, Nora," Blackwell said, ignoring Kieran now. "Everyone in this town will eventually have to choose sides. I had hoped you'd be wise enough to choose mine." "I choose the side of what's right for Utica," she replied. "And that's rarely your side, Victor." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Kieran had the distinct feeling he'd stepped into the middle of a conflict that had been brewing long before his arrival. He shifted slightly, ensuring he could draw his weapon if needed. "You're making a mistake," Blackwell warned. "Both of you." He turned back to his horse but paused before mounting. "Stranger, if you're smart, you'll be gone by noon. Miss Adler can't protect you, and neither can that excuse for a marshal." With that, he swung into his saddle and the group rode away, kicking up dust in their wake. Kieran let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Friend of yours?" he asked dryly. "Victor Blackwell and I have known each other since I arrived in Utica 5 years ago," Nora replied, lowering the shotgun. "He proposed marriage twice. I declined. Our relationship has been strained ever since." Kieran raised an eyebrow. "I can see why you turned him down." "It wasn't his charming personality that failed to win me over," Nora said, a hint of a smile touching her lips for the first time. "It was his belief that everything and everyone has a price." They returned inside, the mood significantly altered from the quiet morning moments earlier. Nora placed the shotgun back in its spot and resumed her seat at the table, though her posture remained alert. "You should leave," she said after a moment. "Blackwell doesn't make idle threats." Kieran studied her across the table. "You stood up for me twice now, why?" "I told you bad for business, I remember." He shook his head. "But there's more to it than that." Nora met his gaze directly. "I don't like bullies, Mr. Kincaid, and Victor Blackwell is the worst kind, one with money and influence. Even so, it's not your fight." "Everything that happens in Utica is my fight." She pushed her coffee cup aside. "This town gave me a second chance when I needed one most. I won't let Blackwell destroy it for his own gain." Kieran recognized the passion in her voice, the same determination that had led him to fight battles that weren't his in another life. "Before Texas, before everything changed. Tell me about this railroad dispute," he said, surprising himself with the request. Nora looked equally surprised but began explaining. "The Union Pacific is planning a spur line through this region to connect with mining operations further north. The original survey had the line passing directly through Utica, which would mean prosperity for the town. But Blackwell wants it rerouted through his ranch lands to increase their value. And the town would suffer if that happens. Utica would slowly die," Nora said simply. "We survive on the cattle trade and as a supply stop for travelers. Without the railroad, we'll become a ghost town within 5 years. So Blackwell intimidates anyone who might support the original route." "Exactly. The survey team has been harassed since they arrived. 2 members have already quit and returned east." Kieran nodded slowly. "And a stranger in town might be another supporter of the original route, or at least someone not under Blackwell's thumb." "Now you understand," Nora said. "Though it doesn't change my advice, you should leave for your own safety." He should leave. Every instinct developed during his years on the run told him to get on his horse and ride away from Utica and its problems. Yet something made him hesitate, perhaps the weariness of always running, or maybe the quiet strength in Nora Adler's eyes. "When is the railroad company making its final decision?" he asked. 2 weeks from now. Their representatives are coming to assess both proposed routes and meet with townsfolk. Kieran took a long drink of his now cooling coffee, his mind working through possibilities. I might stay a few days after all, rest my horse. Nora's expression was unreadable. That would be unwise, Mr. Kincaid. Probably, he agreed. But wisdom and I haven't been on speaking terms for some time. Before she could respond, the door opened and several men entered for breakfast. Nora rose, her innkeeper's demeanor returning seamlessly. Think about what I said, she told Kieran quietly before turning to greet her customers. He did think about it throughout that day and into the next. Rather than continuing his journey, Kieran found himself helping around the inn fixing a loose railing on the porch, replacing shingles damaged in the last storm. Nora didn't ask for his assistance, but she didn't refuse it either. By his third day in Utica, rumors were circulating about the stranger who'd stood up to Victor Blackwell. Some viewed Kieran with suspicion, others with cautious appreciation. Marshal Jenkins paid a visit, casually inquiring about Kieran's background and intentions. Just passing through, Kieran assured him. Needed some work to replenish my funds. Jenkins replied skeptically. And the fact that Nora Adler's giving you room and board has nothing to do with your extended stay. Kieran focused on the hinge he was repairing on the mercantile's door. Miss Adler has been kind enough to exchange lodging for repairs, that's all. She doesn't need help, you know, Jenkins said. That woman can handle anything from bookkeeping to bear hunting, has since her father passed 3 years ago. I've noticed, Kieran said dryly, thinking of how efficiently Nora ran both businesses. But everyone can use an extra pair of hands occasionally. Jenkins regarded him thoughtfully. Blackwell's men are watching you, be careful. The warning proved prophetic. That evening, as Kieran returned from the livery stable where he'd been checking on his horse, 2 men stepped out of an alley to block his path. Blackwell wants to talk, the taller one said, hand resting on his holstered pistol. He knows where to find me, Kieran replied, not breaking stride. The second man moved to intercept him. Now, stranger, or we can make this difficult, Kieran sighed. He'd hoped to avoid confrontation, but these men clearly had other plans. Lead the way, then. They escorted him to the town's only saloon, a raucous establishment at the far end of the main street. Inside, Victor Blackwell sat at a corner table, looking every bit the prosperous rancher in his tailored suit. Mr. Kincaid, Blackwell gestured to an empty chair. Join me for a drink. Kieran remained standing. I prefer to keep this brief. Suit yourself. Blackwell swirled the amber liquid in his glass. I'll be direct then. I want you gone from Utica by morning. I don't take orders from you, Mr. Blackwell. Everyone in this county takes orders from me one way or another. Blackwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. Even the stubborn Miss Adler will eventually see reason. Something in his tone when he mentioned Nora set Kieran's teeth on edge. She seems quite capable of making her own decisions. Women often don't recognize what's best for them, Blackwell replied dismissively. Nora is fiercely independent, but that inn and store of hers operates on razor-thin margins. One bad season could ruin her. Is that a threat, an observation? Blackwell leaned forward. Now, about your departure. I'm prepared to be generous $500 to ensure your journey continues promptly and without incident. Kieran almost laughed. You're trying to bribe me to leave town. I'm offering compensation for your inconvenience. Surely whatever brought you to Wyoming can wait a few more days. I don't want your money, Blackwell, the rancher's expression hardened. Then perhaps you'll respond to something else. My men can make life very difficult for anyone in Utica, including your hostess. Kieran felt a cold anger settle in his chest. Leave Miss Adler out of this. She involved herself when she took you in, Blackwell countered. Nora has always been too willing to champion lost causes. He emptied his glass and set it down with deliberate precision. 24 hours, Mr. Kincaid, then my patience expires. Kieran left the saloon, his mind racing. He'd never intended to become embroiled in Utica's conflicts, yet here he was, a potential catalyst for escalation. The sensible choice was clear. Continue his journey as he'd planned before Nora Adler and her shotgun entered his life. But walking away had never been his strong suit. Even when it should have been, night had fallen by the time he returned to the inn. Most of the dinner patrons had departed, leaving the main room quiet except for a lone figure by the fire. Nora looked up from her ledger as he entered. I was beginning to wonder if Blackwell's men had found you, she said, closing the book. They did. Kieran moved to warm his hands by the fire. We had a pleasant conversation about my travel plans. Nora's expression tightened. And what did you tell him? That I don't take orders from him? Kieran sank into the chair opposite hers. He offered me money to leave. When that didn't work, he threatened to make things difficult for you. Victor's threats are as predictable as they are ineffective, Nora replied, though a shadow crossed her face. I've dealt with worse. Have you? Kieran asked quietly. Something in his tone made her really look at him for the first time since he'd entered. Whatever she saw made her set the ledger aside completely. You're not just some drifter passing through, are you, Mr. Kincaid? He stared into the flames. Everyone's running from something, Miss Adler. Some just have better reasons than others. And your reasons? Kieran hesitated. He hadn't shared his story with anyone in years, had guarded it like a painful wound that might reopen with exposure. Yet something about this woman, her directness, her quiet courage made him want to tell the truth, or at least part of it. I was a Texas Ranger, he said finally. Until 3 years ago when I was convicted of murdering my partner. Nora's expression remained carefully neutral. Did you? No, but evidence was planted, convincing evidence. I spent 2 years in prison before escaping during a transfer. He met her gaze steadily. So now you know. You're harboring a fugitive. I suspected as much, she said calmly, though I admit murder wasn't what I had in mind. You're not surprised, Mr. Kincaid. I've been watching you for days. You have the bearing of a lawman, not a criminal. And if you were the latter, you'd have robbed me blind and been gone by now. She paused. Who framed you? The question caught him off guard. You believe me. Should I not? Kieran shook his head in wonder. Most people would be calling for the marshal by now. I'm not most people. Nora leaned forward. Now, who wanted you out of the way badly enough to murder your partner and frame you for it? A man named Harrington, Kieran replied after a moment. Lawrence Harrington. He controlled half the cattle in our county and was expanding into less legal enterprises. My partner and I were investigating connections between his operation and several stagecoach robberies. And your partner was killed to stop the investigation. Yes, James was shot with my gun while I was supposedly passed out drunk in a saloon. Kieran's jaw tightened at the memory. There were witnesses who claimed to see me leave with him that night, return alone, and make threats against him earlier that day. All lies, but effective ones. Nora was silent for a moment, processing his story, and now you're heading north to start over. That was the plan. He gave a humorless laugh. Until I rode into Utica and found another Harrington waiting for me. Victor isn't as sophisticated as your Texas cattle baron, Nora said, but he's cut from the same cloth. Men who believe their money puts them above the law. Which is why I need to leave, Kieran said firmly. My presence here puts you and others in danger, not just from Blackwell, but from anyone who might recognize me as an escaped convict. Nora rose and moved to the window, looking out at the dark street. If you run now, you'll never stop running. I made peace with that the night I escaped. She turned to face him. And is that really the life you want, Kieran? Always looking over your shoulder, never making connections, never fighting back against the injustice done to you. The use of his given name caught his attention as much as her words. What alternative do I have? Stay, she said simply. Help us stand against Blackwell. When the railroad representatives arrive, they need to see Utica as a unified community worth investing in, not a town cowering under one man's thumb. And after that, I'm still a wanted man, one step at a time. Nora's expression softened slightly. I believe there are ways to address the injustice you've suffered, but running to Montana won't accomplish that. Kieran stared at her, this woman who'd known him less than a week yet spoke as if she understood the weight he carried. Why do you care what happens to me or this town? You could start over somewhere else, somewhere with less conflict. Because some things are worth fighting for, Nora said. This town, justice. A future not dictated by men like Victor Blackwell, she paused. And because I recognize that look in your eyes, I've seen it in my mirror. The revelation hung in the air between them. Before Kieran could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention, shouting, followed by the unmistakable glow of fire reflecting in the window glass. They moved to the door in unison. Down the street, flames were engulfing the newspaper office, the newest building in Utica and the most vocal supporter of the original railroad route. Blackwell, Nora whispered, her face illuminated by the distant fire. This is his answer to defiance. Townspeople were already forming a bucket line from the town pump to the burning building. Kieran hesitated only briefly before rushing to join them. For the next 2 hours, he worked alongside the men and women of Utica, passing buckets and eventually helping to pull smoldering furniture from the building once the flames were subdued. Dawn was breaking by the time the fire was fully extinguished. The newspaper office was largely destroyed, though the stone walls remained standing. The editor, a bespectacled man named Phillips, stood amid the ruins with a dazed expression. "Everything's gone," he murmured as Kieran approached. "The press, my files, the evidence we'd gathered about Blackwell's tampering with the survey team." "Evidence?" Kieran asked sharply. Phillips nodded wearily. "Financial records showing Blackwell paid off 2 of the original surveyors. I was planning to publish it the day the railroad representatives arrived." He kicked at a charred desk in frustration. "Now it's all ash." Kieran placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "Was it the only copy? Of course not. I'm not that foolish." Phillips adjusted his soot-smudged glasses. "I gave duplicates to Marshal Jenkins for safekeeping." Relief flooded through Kieran, but it was short-lived. "Mr. Phillips." A young boy came running up, his face streaked with dirt. "They just took the marshal, Blackwell's men. They rode out with him toward the ranch." The editor's face went pale. "The documents might still be in his office," Kieran finished. "We need to check before Blackwell's men return for them." As they rushed toward the marshal's office, Kieran caught sight of Nora directing cleanup efforts near the burned building. Their eyes met briefly. Something unspoken passed between them before he continued on his urgent mission. The marshal's office was unlocked, its interior undisturbed. Phillips went straight to a filing cabinet behind the desk. "They should be here," he muttered, rifling through papers. "Unless Jenkins moved them." After several tense minutes of searching, Phillips slumped in defeat. "They're gone. Either Jenkins took them with him or Blackwell already has them," Kieran finished grimly. They returned to the street where a crowd had gathered around Nora. She was speaking forcefully, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "This is a direct attack on our town's future," she was saying. "Victor Blackwell thinks he can intimidate us into submission, but he's underestimated Utica before." "What can we do?" someone called out. "He's got the marshal, and his men are armed to the teeth," another added. Nora's gaze found Kieran in the crowd. "We stand together," she answered, still looking at him. "We show the railroad representatives who arrive tomorrow that Utica is worth investing in, not because of Blackwell's money, but because of our determination." Kieran moved to join her, understanding dawning. She was rallying the town, and somehow he'd become part of her plan. "The documents are missing," he told her quietly when he reached her side. "If Blackwell has them, he'll destroy the evidence against him." "Then we need to get them back," she replied, equally low, "along with Marshal Jenkins." "That's a job for the territorial authorities, not a shopkeeper and a fugitive," Kieran warned. Nora's expression was resolute. "The telegraph line was cut last night. No word will reach Cheyenne before the railroad representatives arrive tomorrow. By then, it will be too late." The implications were clear. If they wanted justice, they would have to secure it themselves. It was a dangerous proposition, one that could end with more than a burned building. "Meet me at the inn in an hour," Nora said, turning back to address the concerned townspeople. Kieran slipped away, his mind racing. Confronting Blackwell directly would be suicide, but allowing him to destroy evidence and possibly harm Jenkins wasn't acceptable either. There had to be another approach, something that used his experience as a lawman rather than brute force. When he returned to the inn, he found Nora in her private office behind the mercantile, studying a map spread across her desk. Several other people were present. Phillips, the editor, a silver-haired woman Kieran recognized as the schoolteacher, and a young man who worked at the livery stable. "Ah, Mr. Kincaid," Nora greeted him formally. "I was explaining the layout of Blackwell's ranch to our friends here." Kieran approached the desk, examining the hand-drawn map. "You've been on his property?" "I helped deliver supplies there before our disagreements began," Nora replied. "And Margaret here used to teach Blackwell's niece before she was sent east for schooling." The schoolteacher nodded. "Victor keeps most of his important papers in his study, the northwest corner of the main house." And he's a creature of habit. Every afternoon at 2 o'clock, he inspects the new calves in the south pasture. The ranch is 5 miles outside of town, Nora continued. Normally well guarded, but today most of his men are likely stationed around town, watching for any response to the fire. Kieran saw where this was heading. You're planning a rescue mission. We're planning to retrieve stolen evidence and a kidnapped law officer, Nora corrected. Nothing more. It's still dangerous, Kieran argued. Blackwell won't hesitate to shoot intruders. Which is why timing and distraction are crucial. Nora pointed to different areas of the map. Thomas here will create a diversion at the bunkhouse, drawing attention away from the main house. Margaret knows the housekeeper and can get us inside under the pretense of delivering medicine. And once inside, we find the marshal and the documents. The plan was bold, possibly foolhardy, but Kieran had to admit it had merit. His years as a ranger had taught him that sometimes unorthodox approaches succeeded where direct confrontation would fail. If we're doing this, he said slowly, we need to be prepared for things to go wrong. Blackwell might not follow his usual routine today, not after the fire. That's why I need your expertise, Nora replied. You have experience with operations like this. Kieran spent the next hour refining their plan, addressing contingencies and escape routes. By midday, they were as prepared as they could be. Thomas left first to position himself near the ranch. Margaret would follow shortly with her basket of medicines. Before departing, Kieran found himself alone with Nora as she checked the load in her father's revolver. This isn't your fight, she said, echoing his words from days earlier. You could still leave, avoid risking your freedom for our town. I think we both know I'm staying, Kieran replied. Besides, men like Blackwell and Harrington need to be opposed or they'll never stop. Nora holstered the weapon and faced him. In case this goes poorly, thank you for standing with us when you had every reason to run. Thank me when we succeed, he said, attempting a lightness he didn't feel. They rode out separately to avoid drawing attention, meeting at a stand of cottonwoods a half-mile from Blackwell's ranch. Margaret was already inside the main house. Thomas was positioned near the bunkhouse with a wagon and instructions to create a commotion at precisely 2 o'clock. Ready? Kieran asked as he and Nora tethered their horses in the concealing trees. She nodded, adjusting her shawl to hide the revolver at her waist. I've known Victor Blackwell for 5 years, watched him bully and manipulate his way through this county. I've been ready for this confrontation since the day he threatened to ruin my father if I didn't marry him. The fierceness in her tone surprised Kieran. There's history there you haven't shared. There's history everywhere, Mr. Kincaid. Her expression softened slightly. Perhaps someday we'll have time for those stories. At precisely 2 o'clock, a crash followed by shouts erupted from the direction of the bunkhouse. Smoke began to rise, Thomas setting fire to a hay wagon, as planned. Men ran from various parts of the ranch toward the commotion. Now, Nora whispered, they moved swiftly across the open ground to the rear entrance of the main house. Margaret met them at the door, her normally calm demeanor visibly strained. The marshal is being held in the cellar, she whispered urgently. But Blackwell is still here. He didn't go to the south pasture today. Kieran's heart sank. Where is he? In his study with 2 men. Margaret wrung her hands. The housekeeper is distracted in the kitchen, but we don't have much time. The cellar entrance, Nora asked. Through the pantry behind the kitchen. Kieran considered their options. The plan had hinged on Blackwell being away from the house. We need another distraction. I'll handle it, Margaret said with unexpected resolve. The housekeeper knows me. I'll say I need to speak with Mr. Blackwell about a donation for the school. That should draw him out of the study. Before they could argue, she was moving down the hallway toward the front of the house. Kieran and Nora exchanged glances before continuing toward the kitchen. They could hear Margaret's voice rising as she engaged the housekeeper in conversation. The kitchen was momentarily empty. They slipped through to the pantry and found the cellar door. It was locked. Allow me, Kieran murmured, removing a thin metal tool from his boot, a remnant of his escape from prison that he'd never discarded. The lock gave way with surprising ease. They descended narrow wooden steps into the cool darkness below. In the dim light filtering from small ground-level windows, they could make out a figure slumped against the far wall. Jenkins, Nora whispered, hurrying to the marshal's side. The lawman's face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, but he was conscious. Nora, what in tarnation are you doing here? Rescuing you, she replied, helping him to his feet. Can you walk? I believe so, Jenkins said, though he swayed unsteadily. Blackwell took the documents, said he'd burn them after he forced me to sign a statement saying I'd fabricated the evidence. Did you sign? Kieran asked. Jenkins shook his head painfully. Not yet, that's why I'm still breathing. We need to get to his study, Nora said. The documents might still be there. Too risky, Kieran objected. Getting Jenkins out safely is the priority. From above came the sound of raised voices. Margaret's diversion was working, but it wouldn't last long. Help Jenkins to the horses, Kieran told Nora. I'll check the study. We're not separating, she countered firmly. All three of us go to the study, then all three leave together. There was no time to argue. Supporting Jenkins between them, they climbed back to the pantry and made their way cautiously toward the front of the house. The voices were coming from the main parlor now, Margaret's clear tones intermingled with Blackwell's deeper rumble. There, Jenkins whispered, nodding toward a door across the hallway. That's his study. They reached it without incident. The door was unlocked, the room empty. Kieran quickly began searching the large desk that dominated the space while Nora kept watch at the door. Nothing, he muttered after checking the most obvious hiding places. The safe, Jenkins suggested, nodding toward a painting on the wall. Behind that landscape, Kieran moved the painting aside, revealing a small wall safe. It's locked. Try 4821, the marshal said. His niece's birthday. I noticed him using it once when I was here on official business. The combination worked. Inside the safe were several documents, including the financial records Phillips had described. Kieran pocketed them quickly. We've got what we came for, he said. Let's go. They had nearly reached the kitchen when a shout behind them froze them in place. One of Blackwell's men stood at the end of the hallway, his gun already drawn. Don't move, he barked. Mr. Blackwell, they're trying to escape with the marshal. There was no time for subtlety. Kieran shoved Jenkins toward Nora and drew his revolver in one fluid motion. His first shot caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him into the wall. His second missed as their target dropped to the floor, returning fire. Go, Kieran shouted, positioning himself to cover their retreat. Nora pulled Jenkins through the kitchen and out the rear door as Kieran backed slowly after them, keeping his gun trained on the hallway. More shouts came from the front of the house, Blackwell and his men responding to the gunfire. Outside, they ran for the cottonwoods, half carrying the weakened marshal between them. Shots rang out behind them as they reached the trees and scrambled onto their horses, Jenkins sharing Nora's mount. The South Road, Nora directed as they rode hard away from the ranch. They'll expect us to head straight back to town. They rode for nearly an hour, taking a circuitous route back toward Utica. Only when they were certain they weren't being followed did they slow their pace to rest the winded horses. That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever been part of, Jenkins said as they walked their mounts along a stream bank. Probably both. We got what we needed, Kieran replied, patting the pocket containing the documents, proof of Blackwell's corruption. But at what cost? The marshal's battered face was grim. He'll come after you both with everything he has now. Let him, Nora said with quiet determination. The railroad representatives will see the evidence tomorrow. After that, Blackwell's influence will begin to wane. You're assuming we survive until tomorrow, Jenkins pointed out. Kieran shared the marshal's concern. Blackwell wouldn't wait patiently for the railroad's decision. He would act quickly to eliminate the threat to his plans. We'll need to secure the documents somewhere safe, he said, and prepare the town for Blackwell's retaliation. By the time they reached Utica, word of their exploits had somehow preceded them. Phillips met them at the edge of town, his face alight with excitement. Is it true? He asked breathlessly. You rescued the marshal and recovered the evidence. News travels fast, Kieran observed dryly. Thomas returned an hour ago, Phillips explained. Said there was gunfire at the ranch and that you were being pursued. Jenkins dismounted carefully, still unsteady. We need to get these documents to safety and prepare for Blackwell's response. The town quickly mobilized. Men armed themselves and established lookouts at the approaches to Utica. Women gathered supplies and prepared the school building as both a defensive position and a meeting place for the railroad representatives due to arrive the next morning. As darkness fell, Kieran found himself on the roof of the inn with Nora, watching the western road for signs of Blackwell's men. "Do you think he'll attack tonight?" she asked, her voice calm despite the circumstances. "If I were him, I would," Kieran replied honestly. "Hit hard before the representatives arrive, destroy the evidence, and make an example of anyone who opposed him." Nora nodded, accepting his assessment. "I've lived with the threat of Victor Blackwell for years. Tonight might finally bring an end to it one way or another." "You never explained how a woman like you ended up running an inn and store in a place like Utica," Kieran said, partly to distract them both from the tense vigil. She smiled faintly in the moonlight. "How did a Texas Ranger end up a fugitive in Wyoming? We all have our stories, Mr. Kincaid." "Fair enough," he returned her smile, "but since we might be facing Blackwell's entire crew before dawn, I'd like to know who I'm fighting alongside." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I came west with my father after my mother died in '68. He was a merchant in Philadelphia who lost everything in bad investments. Utica was as far as our money would take us." Her voice softened with memory. "He built the store first, then the inn, worked himself to illness doing it. I took over more and more as his health failed." "And Blackwell?" "He arrived in '71, bought the largest ranch in the county, started courting me the following year." Her expression hardened. "When I refused him, he threatened to ruin my father financially, said he could ensure no suppliers would sell to us, no travelers would stay at our inn. But he didn't follow through. My father confronted him publicly, told the whole town about the threats. Blackwell backed down rather than have his reputation damaged." Nora's gaze remained fixed on the distant road, but he never forgave the humiliation. "When father died, Victor assumed I'd be more amenable to his proposal. I wasn't." Kieran studied her profile, understanding better the steel beneath her composed exterior. "You've been fighting him alone all this time." "Not alone," she corrected. "Utica has good people. But yes, I've stood against him when others couldn't risk it. And now we all stand together." She turned to face him fully. "Including you, a man who could have ridden away without consequence." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Kieran found himself wanting to reach for her hand but restrained the impulse. "Movement on the road," he said instead, pointing to distant lantern light. They watched as a group of riders approached town, at least 15 men, moving slowly and deliberately. Blackwell's force was larger than anticipated. "We need to warn the others," Nora said, already moving toward the ladder. Kieran followed her down and into the street, where they quickly spread the alarm. Within minutes, the town's defenders were in position. Storekeepers, ranchers, and ordinary citizens united against a common threat. Marshal Jenkins, despite his injuries, took charge of organizing their defense. "They'll expect us to concentrate at the main approaches," he told the gathered men. "We need to be smarter than that." Their strategy was simple but effective. Allow Blackwell's men to enter town, then close around them, using the buildings for cover. The women and children were secured in the sturdy stone schoolhouse, the documents locked in its safe. Kieran positioned himself with Nora and 3 others behind the mercantile, where they had a clear view of the main street. The night was unnaturally quiet as Blackwell's riders entered Utica, spreading out in search of their quarry. "Where is everyone?" they heard one man mutter. "Town's like a graveyard. Check the inn," another replied. "The woman and that stranger will be there." Kieran tensed as 2 riders approached their position. Nora's hand found his arm in the darkness, a steadying presence. "Wait for Jenkins' signal," she whispered. The signal came moments later, a single shot fired from the direction of the church. Instantly, the defenders of Utica emerged from hiding, weapons trained on the startled raiders. "Drop your weapons," Jenkins' voice rang out clearly. "You're surrounded." For a heartbeat, the tableau held Blackwell's men frozen in surprise, the townspeople steady in their determination. Then someone fired, and the night erupted into chaos. Kieran pulled Nora behind a water trough as bullets splintered the wood around them. He returned fire carefully, mindful of his limited ammunition. Across the street, he could see Phillips and the blacksmith pinned down by 2 of Blackwell's men. "Cover me," Kieran told Nora before darting across the open ground, using the darkness to his advantage. He reached the opposite side unscathed and flanked the attackers, disarming one with a well-placed shot to the hand. The other surrendered quickly when faced with Kieran's revolver at close range. The firefight was brief but intense. Blackwell's men, expecting an easy raid against unprepared townspeople, found themselves outmaneuvered and surrounded. Several were wounded, none killed. A mercy Kieran suspected they wouldn't have extended had the situation been reversed. Within 20 minutes, it was over. Blackwell's men were disarmed and corralled in the livery stable under guard, but of Victor Blackwell himself there was no sign. He wasn't with them, Jenkins confirmed, wiping blood from a reopened cut on his face. Must have sent his men to do his dirty work. Or he's planning something else, Kieran suggested grimly. His instinct proved correct. As they regrouped in the center of town, a lone figure emerged from the shadows near the schoolhouse. Victor Blackwell stood on the steps, his rifle aimed at the building's door. "Nobody move," he called out, his voice carrying in the still night air. "I've got a proposition for you all." "Let me guess," Jenkins replied. "You want the documents in exchange for not burning down the school?" Blackwell laughed coldly. "You know me too well, Marshal. Except the school's already prepared to burn, coal oil on the foundation, just waiting for a match." Kieran assessed the situation rapidly. The schoolhouse contained not only the incriminating documents, but also most of the town's women and children. Blackwell had chosen his target well. "What do you want, Victor?" Nora stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear Kieran knew she must be feeling. "You know what I want, Nora." Blackwell's tone softened slightly. "I want what's mine, this town, its future, and yes, even you. I've been patient long enough." "The town was never yours," she replied, "and neither was I." "Then I'll take what I can get." Blackwell shifted his rifle. "The documents, now, or this building burns with everyone inside." Time seemed to slow as Kieran considered their options. Rushing Blackwell would likely result in him firing or setting the fire before they could reach him. Surrendering the documents meant giving up their best chance at ending his control over Utica. Then he saw a slight movement at the schoolhouse's side window. A small hand pushing the shutters open, followed by the barrel of a shotgun. The schoolteacher, Margaret, was positioned to flank Blackwell, but she needed a distraction. Kieran stepped forward. "I have the documents," he lied, drawing Blackwell's attention. "They're in my saddlebag." "I'll get them, but you need to move away from that building first. You're not in a position to negotiate, stranger." Blackwell kept his rifle trained on the school door. "Neither are you," Kieran countered. "Kill these people, and the territorial authorities will hunt you to the ends of the earth." "Is that really what you want, to spend your life running?" The words hit closer to home than Blackwell could possibly know. For a moment the rancher's resolve seemed to waver. "The documents first," he insisted. "Then we can discuss terms." "Victor." Nora's voice was different now, softer, almost conciliatory. She moved forward slowly, hands visible. "This has gone too far. People could have died tonight." "People still might," Blackwell warned, but his eyes followed her movement. "We were neighbors once," she continued, moving closer step by careful step. "Before all this bitterness. Remember when you helped us rebuild after the flood of '72? That's the man I want to speak with now." Her strategy became clear to Kieran. She was drawing Blackwell's focus, while positioning herself to block his line of fire to the schoolhouse door. It was brave and incredibly dangerous. "That man discovered kindness was mistaken for weakness," Blackwell replied, but his rifle barrel dipped slightly. From the corner of his eye, Kieran could see Margaret at the window, taking careful aim. He needed to ensure Nora was out of the line of fire when the shot came. "The railroad is coming whether you want it to or not," Kieran said loudly, drawing Blackwell's attention back to him. "The smart play is to accept it, work with the town instead of against it." "The smart play is to control it," Blackwell snapped. "Something you drifters wouldn't understand, building something that lasts. Like burning down buildings and threatening women and children," Jenkins interjected from another direction, further dividing Blackwell's attention. "That's not building, Victor, that's destroying." Blackwell's composure was beginning to crack. "Enough talk, the documents now or I light this place up." He reached for his pocket, presumably for matches, and in that instant Margaret fired. The shotgun blast caught Blackwell in the side, spinning him away from the schoolhouse steps. His rifle clattered to the ground as he fell. Kieran was moving before the echo of the shot faded, rushing to secure Blackwell's weapon and check his condition. The rancher was alive but badly wounded, blood spreading across his expensive coat. "You should have killed me," Blackwell gasped as Kieran knelt beside him. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Kieran replied, applying pressure to the wound. "For you, at least." The following hours passed in a blur of activity. A doctor was summoned to treat Blackwell and the other wounded. The schoolhouse was cleared of the coal oil Blackwell had doused it with. Statements were taken from witnesses, and telegrams prepared to send to the territorial capital once the lines were repaired. Dawn found Kieran sitting on the inn's porch, watching as the first rays of sunlight illuminated a town forever changed by the night's events. Nora joined him, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "The railroad representatives should arrive by noon," she said, handing him a cup. "Phillips is already preparing a special edition of the newspaper detailing Blackwell's corruption and last night's attack." Kieran accepted the coffee gratefully. "What will happen to Blackwell?" "The doctor says he'll live to stand trial." Nora settled beside him on the bench. "Between the attempted arson, kidnapping the marshal, and the evidence of his bribing the survey team, he'll likely spend years in prison. And Utica will thrive with the railroad connection," she smiled slightly, "though we might need a new marshal." Jenkins is talking about retirement after last night. The implication hung in the air between them. Kieran stared into his coffee, considering possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to contemplate in years. "A fugitive can't be a marshal," he said finally. "A man unjustly accused might find support in the right community," Nora countered. "Especially one that owes him a debt for standing with them when he could have run." Kieran looked at her, truly looked at her for perhaps the first time. The morning light caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, the determined set of her jaw softened by the hint of vulnerability in her eyes. "You're suggesting I stay in Utica?" "I'm suggesting you stop running," she replied simply. "Fight the injustice done to you instead of letting it define your life." "And how would I do that? We have a newspaper now, connections to territorial officials through the railroad, resources you didn't have in Texas." She hesitated. "And people willing to stand beside you as you stood beside us." The offer was tempting, more tempting than anything Kieran had encountered since his world collapsed 3 years earlier. But the weight of his past, the danger it represented to anyone close to him, couldn't be dismissed so easily. "Harrington is still out there," he said. "If he discovers where I am, then we face him together," Nora interrupted. "As we faced Blackwell, her certainty was both alarming and deeply moving. You don't even know me, not really." "I know enough." Her hand found his on the bench between them. "I know you're a man who risked his freedom for strangers, who chose to fight for what's right when running would have been easier, the rest. Well, we have time for that." The touch of her hand was warm, grounding in a way Kieran hadn't experienced in years. The prospect she offered not just safety or purpose, but connection, belonging was almost too much to process after so long alone. "I need to think," he said finally, though he didn't pull his hand away. "Of course." Nora's smile held understanding, "but don't think too long." "Jenkins says Blackwell's men are already talking, hoping to make deals. They're confirming everything in those documents." They sat in companionable silence as the town awakened around them, shopkeepers opening their doors, children heading to school, life continuing despite the drama of the previous night. It was, Kieran realized, what he'd been searching for all along, not just a place to hide, but a place to live. When the railroad representatives arrived that afternoon, they found a united community prepared to present their case. Phillips proudly displayed his evidence of Blackwell's corruption. Jenkins, bandaged but resolute, described the rancher's escalating crimes. And Nora, speaking with the quiet authority that had first caught Kieran's attention, outlined Utica's potential as a thriving railroad stop. Kieran stood at the back of the gathering, watching as the future of Utica took shape before him. When one of the representatives asked about the commotion of the previous night, eyes turned to him expectantly. "This town faced a challenge," he said simply, "and met it with courage and unity. That's the kind of community worth investing in." His words seemed to strike a chord with the officials. By evening, the decision was made. The original route through Utica would be maintained. Construction would begin within the month. The celebration that followed was joyous, but tempered by awareness of how close they'd come to losing everything. As townspeople gathered in the main street for an impromptu festival, Kieran found himself increasingly restless. The decision he'd been avoiding could no longer be postponed. Under cover of the celebrations, he returned to the inn and climbed to his room. His few possessions were quickly gathered, his saddlebags packed. He would leave tonight while the town was distracted by victory. It was safer that way for everyone. The moon was high as he descended the stairs, his footsteps muffled by the distant sounds of music and laughter. He placed the room key on the counter one final time, alongside payment for his stay. "So you're running again." Nora stood in the doorway to her quarters, a lamp in her hand casting shadows across her face. She didn't look surprised, just disappointed. "It's better this way," Kieran said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Safer for you in the town, safer." She set the lamp down and approached him. "Is that what you've been telling yourself these past 3 years? That you're protecting others by denying yourself a home, connections, a life?" "It's the truth," he insisted. "Harrington doesn't forgive or forget. If he learns where I am, then you face him with people at your back instead of alone." Nora's expression softened. "Kieran, running hasn't made you safer, it's just made you lonely." The use of his given name caught him again, intimate, personal in a way he'd avoided for too long. "You don't understand the risk. I understand that life without risk isn't living, it's just existing." She gestured to the room around them. "I could have left Utica when Blackwell first threatened me, found somewhere easier, safer, but this is my home, I chose to fight for it." "That's different, is it?" Nora stepped closer. "You've been fighting shadows for 3 years. Isn't it time to stand and face them instead?" Kieran found himself at a loss for words. Everything in him trained for flight, for self-preservation, was at war with a newer, deeper longing for connection, for purpose for her. "I don't know how to stop running," he admitted finally, the confession painful in its honesty. Nora's hand came to rest on his arm. "You start by not walking out that door tonight." Her touch anchored him, made the decision real in a way abstract consideration hadn't. "And then we take it one day at a time." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Marshal Jenkins is resigning at the end of the month. The town needs someone who understands the law and isn't afraid to stand up to men like Blackwell. A fugitive as Marshal," he shook his head at the irony, "a man unjustly accused, working to clear his name while protecting a community that respects him." She smiled slightly. "The world is changing, Kieran. The frontier is giving way to civilization. Maybe it's time your story changed too." The possibility hung before him like a door half open, revealing glimpses of a future he'd stopped believing possible, a life in Utica, purpose, connection. "Nora. I can't promise I'll succeed," he said cautiously. "Clearing my name might be impossible after all this time." "Then we face that reality together." Her hand moved from his arm to his face, a gesture so tender it nearly undid him. "But not tonight. Tonight you need to rest." Kieran placed his saddlebags on the counter beside the key and payment. A symbolic gesture perhaps, but a meaningful one. "I'll stay until morning." "Not in that state," Nora said, nodding to his travel-ready appearance. "Sit back down, you look exhausted." The echo of his intention to leave before dawn, countered by her quiet insistence, struck Kieran as significant a crossroads moment, though he couldn't have articulated why. He allowed her to guide him to a chair by the fire, where she poured him a small measure of whiskey. "To new beginnings," she offered, taking a seat across from him. "To facing shadows instead of running from them," he countered, raising his glass. They talked late into the night, sharing stories they'd both kept hidden for too long. Kieran spoke of his time as a ranger, of the partnership with James that had ended in tragedy, of the evidence that had sent him to prison despite his innocence. Nora told him of her life in Philadelphia, of her father's struggles and triumphs, of the community that had become family after his death. When dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they were still talking, possibilities unfolding between them like flowers opening to the sun. "The railroad representatives are meeting with the town council this morning," Nora said, stifling a yawn. "Will you join us?" It was a simple question on the surface, but they both recognized it for what it was, an invitation not just to a meeting, but to become part of the community, to invest in its future. "I believe I will," Kieran replied, the decision feeling right in a way few had in recent years. The meeting passed in a blur of technical discussions and future planning. Kieran found himself unexpectedly engaged, offering suggestions based on his experiences in Texas and the territories he'd traveled through. The representatives listened respectfully, even deferentially once Jenkins introduced him as the man who helped save our town and our likely next marshal. By midday, contracts were being prepared and the future of Utica seemed secure. As the gathering dispersed, Jenkins pulled Kieran aside. "I meant what I said about the marshal position," the older man told him. "Town needs someone with your experience and integrity, even with my background," Kieran asked skeptically, "especially with your background." Jenkins tapped the badge on his vest. "This job is about justice, not just law. You understand the difference better than most." The offer was tempting, more so than Kieran would have believed possible days earlier. "Let me think about it." "Don't think too long," Jenkins advised with a knowing smile. "Some opportunities and people don't wait forever." His meaning was clear. As if summoned by the thought, Nora appeared, looking tired but triumphant after the successful negotiations. "Walk with me," she asked Kieran. "I could use some fresh air after all that talk of railroad specifications." They strolled toward the edge of town where the prairie stretched vast and golden under the afternoon sun. In the distance, surveyors were already at work, marking the route the railroad would take. "It's really happening," Nora said, watching their activity. "Utica is going to thrive." "Thanks in large part to you," Kieran observed. "Your father would be proud." She smiled at that. "I think he would be. He always believed in this town's potential." After a pause, she added, "Jenkins offered you the marshal's position, didn't he? News travels fast in Utica." "It's a small town," she agreed. "Though not for long once the railroad comes." They continued walking in companionable silence, the future spreading before them like the prairie wide open, full of possibility and challenges in equal measure. "I'm going to stay," Kieran said finally. "Accept the marshal's position, at least temporarily." Nora's smile was worth every risk the decision entailed. "I hoped you would." "I can't promise I'll be able to clear my name," he cautioned, "or that Harrington won't eventually find me." "I'm not asking for promises," she replied. "Just that you stop running long enough to see what might be possible here." The implication in her words warmed him more than the afternoon sun. "And what might be possible, Miss Adler?" Her expression softened. "I think you know Marshal Kincaid." He did know. He'd known since that first night when she stood fearlessly in the doorway of her inn, shotgun in hand, defending a stranger from unseen assailants. Something had begun between them, then something neither had been looking for, but both now recognized as valuable beyond measure. "It won't be easy," he warned. "I've been alone a long time." "So have I," she admitted. "But I think we both remember how not to be." The railroad came to Utica that autumn, bringing with it prosperity, new settlers, and increased connections to the wider world. The town grew rapidly, with new businesses opening and existing ones expanding to meet the demands of progress. Kieran settled into the role of marshal with surprising ease, finding that his years as a ranger had prepared him well for the challenges of a growing frontier town. With the territorial governor's provisional approval secured through the influence of grateful railroad officials, he served openly, despite his fugitive status, working diligently to maintain order as Utica transformed around him. Nora's businesses flourished. The inn expanded to accommodate increasing numbers of travelers, and the mercantile became a central hub for the community. Together, she and Kieran formed the stable core of Utica's leadership, their partnership extending beyond civic matters as the seasons changed. They were married the following spring, in a ceremony that the entire town turned out to witness. Philip's newspaper described it as the union of two pillars of our community, whose courage and vision have helped shape Utica's promising future. It was Margaret who first suggested using the newspaper's connections to investigate Kieran's case. Within months, a series of articles detailed the circumstances of his conviction, raising questions about evidence and procedures that caught the attention of authorities in Texas. By summer's end, surprising news arrived. Lawrence Harrington had been arrested on unrelated charges of fraud and embezzlement. During interrogation, facing significant prison time, he had confessed to numerous crimes, including the murder of Ranger James Bailey and the framing of his partner. The official pardon arrived on a crisp October morning, delivered personally by a Texas Ranger who had once served alongside Kieran. The document restored his rights and name, officially clearing him of all charges related to his partner's death. "It's finally over," Nora said as they stood on the porch of their home, a modest house they had built on the outskirts of town. "You're free." Kieran held the pardon in hands that trembled slightly. 3 years of running, another year of waiting. It doesn't seem real, but it is. She took his hand, guiding it to the slight swell of her belly where their child grew. "And now you can truly begin again. We can begin without shadows hanging over us." Their daughter was born that winter, a strong, healthy girl with her mother's determined expression and her father's thoughtful eyes. They named her Hope, a testament to what they had found in each other and in Utica. As spring returned to the high plains of Wyoming, bringing new growth and possibilities, Kieran stood on their porch watching the sun rise over a town transformed. Railroad tracks gleamed in the distance, connecting Utica to the wider world. New buildings stood where empty lots had been when he first arrived, and beside him, Nora cradled their daughter, the embodiment of a future he'd once stopped believing possible. "Any regrets?" she asked, noticing his contemplative expression. Kieran smiled, remembering that night nearly 2 years earlier when he'd tried to leave before dawn and how her simple words had changed the course of his life. "Not a single one," he replied, drawing his family close as the new day began.